photograph sat on Ellie Harper's desk, its edges curling like the petals of a dying flower. Black and white, grainy, it captured a moment frozen in 1953, a quiet street in Willow Creek, Indiana, bathed in the soft glow of a street lamp. A body lay crumpled near the curb, Margaret Maggie Tate, 28, her dark hair fanned out on the pavement, her eyes open and unseeing. The town's only unsolved murder, it had haunted Ellie's family. Her grandmother's notes mentioned no bystander. Mrs. Delaney, the librarian, eyed her curiously as she requested 1950s files. Tate case, huh? The old woman rasped, adjusting her glasses. Folks still whisper about it. Bad business. She shuffled off, returning with a stack of brittle newspapers and a microfiche reel. Ellie dug in, scanning headlines. Local woman found dead. Murder stumps sheriff. Town mourns Maggie Tate. Nothing about a boy or a witness. Then, in a faded society column, a name caught her eye. Tommy Weaver, 12, winner of a spelling bee, October 10, 1953. A week before the murder. She cross-checked the census. Tommy lived on Mason Avenue. Her breath hitched. Could he be the boy? And if he'd seen something, someone, why had he stayed silent? As dusk fell, Ellie left the library, the photo heavier in her bag. Tommy Weaver would be in his 80s now if he was alive. She'd find him. But as she passed the oak on Mason Avenue, a shadow shifted. Just for a moment, quick as a blink. She froze, staring. Nothing. Just the wind, she told herself. Yet the chill stayed, and the silent witness felt closer than ever. The street lamp on Mason Avenue buzzed faintly as Ellie stood beneath it, her breath fogging in the crisp evening air. The shadow she'd glimpsed or imagined had vanished, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the weight of her unease. She clutched the photograph tighter, the silent witness's blurred form burning in her mind. Tommy Weaver, the boy from the newspaper, was her next step. If he'd lived here in 1953, if he'd seen something, he might hold the key to Maggie Tate's death, and the figure watching from the shadows. Willow Creek's phone book was a relic, but the library had one from the 90s, the latest she could find. No Tommy Weaver listed, though a T. Weaver appeared on Oak Street, a mile away. It was a long shot. People moved, died, faded, but Ellie drove there anyway, the town's quiet streets stretching into dusk. Oak Street was a row of modest bungalows, their lawns patchy, their porch lights flickering on like sleepy eyes. Number 17 had a rusted mailbox with Weaver stenciled in peeling paint. She parked, her heart thudding, and approached the door. An old man answered her knock, his face creased like crumpled paper, his eyes sharp behind thick glasses. He leaned on a cane, sizing her up. Yeah, he grunted, voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. Ellie swallowed, holding out her ID. Mr. Weaver? I'm Ellie Harper, a forensic artist. I'm looking into an old case, the Maggie Tate murder. Were you Tommy Weaver from Mason Avenue in 1953? His expression tightened, a flicker of something fear? Memory crossing his face before he masked it. That's a name I ain't heard in a while, he said, stepping back. Come in, but don't expect much. Past is past. The living room smelled of stale coffee and liniment, its walls lined with faded photos, a young Tommy in a baseball cap, a wedding shot, a family at a picnic. Ellie sat on a sagging couch, the photograph in her lap. I found this in my grandmother's things, she began, sliding it toward him. She was a cop back then, Ruth Harper. Took this the night Maggie died. I enhanced it and there's someone in the background. Watching. Tommy's hand trembled as he took the photo, his glasses slipping down his nose. He stared at it, silent, then set it down like it burned. Don't know nothing about that, he muttered, but his eyes darted to the window. Mr. Weaver, Ellie pressed, leaning forward, there was a letter with her notes. Said the shadow saw it all and to ask the boy. You lived on that street. You were 12. Did you see something? He shifted, his cane tapping the floor, a nervous rhythm. Kids see all kinds of things, he said finally. Doesn't mean it's real. I was asleep that night. Heard the commotion later, cops, lights. That's all. She didn't believe him. His voice was too tight, his hands too restless. This figure, she said, tapping the photo. It's not in the reports. No one mentioned it. But it's there, clear as day now. If you saw it, if you know who it was. Tommy cut her off, standing abruptly. I told you, I don't know. You're digging up ghosts, girl. Let it lie. He limped to the door, holding it open. Go home. Ellie stood, reluctant, but grabbed the photo and stepped outside. "If you change your mind, I'm staying at the Willow Inn," she said. He didn't reply, just shut the door with a thud. The night was dark now, the streetlights casting long shadows that stretched toward her car. She drove back to the inn, a squat motel on the town's edge, her mind churning. Tommy was hiding something, fear, guilt, maybe both. She needed more. In her room, she spread her grandmother's notes across the bed, the letter on top. The shadow saw it all. "Ask the boy." She pulled out her laptop, plugging in a USB microscope she used for fine detail work. The envelope's postmark was smudged, October 20th, 1954, but under the lens, faint initials emerged in the ink. AL, not much, but a start. She cross-checked her grandmother's files. No EL in the witness list. A dead end unless Tommy talked. Sleep eluded her, the photo haunting her dreams when she finally drifted off. A figure stepping out of the shadows, faceless, reaching. She woke at dawn, gritty-eyed, and headed to the diner across from the inn. The locals eyed her over their coffee, whispers trailing her to a booth. "Heard you're asking about Maggie Tate," a waitress said, refilling her mug. "Folks don't like it. Bad luck." "I found something new," Ellie replied, keeping her voice low. "A witness nobody saw back then." The waitress, Doris, her name tag read, paused, then slid into the booth. "My uncle was the night watchman who found her. Said the street felt wrong that night, like someone was there, but he couldn't see him. Spooked him till he died." Ellie's pulse quickened. "Did he ever mention a boy? Tommy Weaver?" Doris frowned. "Tommy? Nah, but he lived next door to Maggie. Quiet kid, kept to himself after that. Moved away for a bit, came back old." She leaned closer. "If you're poking around, check the old Tate house. Still standing, empty. People say it's cursed." Ellie nodded, scribbling the address, 14 Mason Avenue. Another lead. As she left the diner, her phone buzzed, a withheld number. Furniture sat draped in sheets, frozen in time, and a staircase creaked under its own weight in the corner. She pulled out her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, and started exploring. The living room held little, a cracked mirror, a faded rug, but upstairs, Maggie's bedroom stopped her cold. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled as if someone had just leapt out, and a vanity mirror reflected her own startled face. On the dresser, a jewelry box sat open, its contents spilled, a pearl necklace, a silver ring, a locket. Ellie picked up the locket, its clasp stiff but yielding. Inside, a photo of Maggie smiled back, young, alive, her dark hair pinned up. Beside her stood a boy, maybe 10, grinning gap-toothed. Tommy Weaver? Her pulse raced. If this was Tommy, he'd known Maggie closely. Why hadn't he said anything? She pocketed the locket, guilt prickling at the theft, but it was evidence now. Downstairs, she found a kitchen with a back door ajar, its frame splintered as if forced. The night watchman's report flashed in her mind, no signs of break-in. Yet here it was, overlooked or ignored. Outside, the yard was overgrown, a rusted swing set tilting in the weeds. She circled to the oak, its trunk scarred with old carvings, hearts, initials, childish scrawls. One caught her eye, TW plus MT52 etched deep, the bark grown around it. Tommy and Maggie. Friends, maybe more. Ellie snapped a photo, the connection solidifying. He'd lied about being asleep, he'd been part of her life. Back at the inn, she spread her finds across the bed, the locket, the enhanced photo, her grandmother's notes. The letter's initials, EL, nagged at her. She called the library, catching Mrs. Delaney before closing. "Any residents in 54 with initials EL?" she asked. A pause, then Edith Larson, maybe? Lived on Pine Street, died in 60. Odd duck, kept to herself. Ellie thanked her, jotting it down. Another thread, thin but tangible. Dusk settled as she drove to Pine Street. Now a row of newer homes. Edith's old lot, a vacant patch of dirt. No help there. Frustrated, she returned to Mason Avenue, drawn back to the oak. The street was empty, the lamp flickering to life as night fell. She stood where the silent witness had, mimicking its pose, hatless, coatless, but still, and felt a chill that wasn't the wind. Her phone buzzed again, withheld number. She answered, breath held. "You're close," the same raspy voice hissed. "Too close." Click. She spun, flashlight sweeping the street. Nothing, or was there? A flicker, a shape, darting behind a house across the way. Adrenaline surged, and she chased it, her boots pounding asphalt. The figure slipped into an alley, too fast, too silent, and when she rounded the corner, it was gone. Just shadows and a dumpster, its lid creaking in the breeze. She cursed, panting, then noticed something on the ground. A cigarette, but still warm, its ember faintly glowing. Back in her room, she examined it under her microscope. Cheap tobacco, a brand her grandmother's notes mentioned. Suspect smoked Lucky Strikes, per witness. No suspect had ever been named, though. She cross-referenced Tommy's story, nothing about smoking, but the butt tied the past to now. Someone was here, watching, just like in 53. The silent witness wasn't a ghost. It was flesh and blood, and it knew she was digging. Sleep came fitfully, dreams of Maggie's lifeless stare and a faceless figure under the oak. She woke to a knock, sharp, insistent. The clock read 3 a.m. She peered through the peephole. No one. Opening the door, she found a note slipped underneath, scrawled in shaky ink. "Meet me at the Oak, midnight. T.W. Tommy." Her stomach flipped. He was ready to talk, or to silence her. Ellie's motel room felt smaller as the clock ticked toward midnight. The note from Tommy Weaver. "Meet me at the Oak, midnight. T.W." A jagged weight on her nightstand. She'd spent the day piecing together fragments. The locket linking Tommy to Maggie, the cigarette but tying the past to the present, the raspy voice warning her off. The silent witness was no longer just a shadow in a photo. It was a living thread, pulling her deeper into Willow Creek's buried secrets. She couldn't tell if Tommy's note was a breakthrough or a trap, but she had to go. She dressed in dark jeans and a jacket, tucking the enhanced photo, her grandmother's notes, and a pocket knife into her bag, just in case. The inn was silent as she slipped out, the town draped in a stillness that mirrored 1953. Mason Avenue was a 5-minute walk. The street lamps hummed the only sound as she approached the oak. Its branches swayed faintly, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the pavement. She checked her watch. 11:58 p.m. No sign of Tommy. At midnight, a figure emerged from behind the tree, stooped, leaning on a cane, his glasses glinting in the dim light. Tommy Weaver. He looked older in the dark, his face etched with something heavier than age. "You came," he said, his voice low, roughened by years and guilt. Ellie stepped closer, wary. "You asked me to. Said you didn't know anything. Why the change?" He glanced around, eyes darting to the shadows, then motioned her to follow. They moved to the Tate house's porch, its boards creaking underfoot. "Safer here," he muttered, easing onto a step. "Less eyes." Ellie sat beside him, the photo in her hand. "This figure," she said, pointing to the silent witness. "You saw it that night, didn't you? You knew Maggie. The locket, the carving. You weren't asleep." Tommy's shoulders sagged, his cane tapping a slow rhythm. "I lied," he admitted, barely a whisper. "I was there. Maggie. She was my sister's best friend. Like family. That night, I couldn't sleep. Heard her leave the house next door. I followed, quiet-like, through the yard. Saw her on the street arguing with someone. Then she fell hard. Didn't move after." His voice broke, eyes distant. "I hid by the oak, scared stiff. Saw him standing there, watching her die." "Him?" Ellie pressed, her pulse quickening. "Who?" Tommy shook his head. "Couldn't see his face, hat low, coat dark. Same as your picture. He didn't run, just stood there, like he wanted to be sure she was gone. Then he lit a cigarette. Lucky strike. I smelled it and walked off. I ran home, told no one. Too afraid." Ellie's mind raced. Why not tell the cops? My grandmother. Tommy's laugh was bitter. A kid's word against nothing? No proof, no name. And that letter, the shadow saw it all. Came a year later. Found it on our porch, no sender. I thought he knew I'd seen him. Kept my mouth shut after that. He pointed to the photo. That's him, though. I'd swear it. She pulled out the cigarette butt from the alley. This was dropped yesterday, near here. Same brand. He's still around, Tommy. Watching me now. His face paled, hands trembling. Jesus, he breathed. I thought he'd died maybe? But if he's here, he trailed off, fear swallowing his words. A twig snapped across the street, sharp in the silence. Ellie's head jerked up, flashlight sweeping the darkness. Nothing, but the air felt heavier, eyes on them. He knows we're talking, she said, standing. Tommy grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Don't go after him. He's dangerous, always was. Maggie wasn't the first. Her stomach dropped. What do you mean? Tommy's eyes glistened, haunted. Before her, 51, a drifter went missing. Folks said he'd moved on, but I saw him arguing with a man, same coat, same hat, near the creek. Never saw the drifter again. Maggie knew something about it, I think. She'd been asking questions, poking around. That's why he got her. Ellie's breath caught. 2 deaths connected by a shadow. Why didn't you say this sooner, she demanded. Tommy released her, slumping. Fear. Shame. I was a coward then, still am. But you're stirring it up. He won't let you walk away. The street lamp flickered, casting Tommy's face in stark relief. She pulled out her phone, recording now. Tell me everything, description, anything you remember. He hesitated, then spoke, tall, thin. Moved slow, deliberate. Smoked like it was a ritual. Wore a fedora, gray, tilted. Voice low, rough, like gravel. Heard him mutter once, no loose ends. Ellie nodded, the pieces clicking. Edith Larson, maybe a link. I'll find him, she said. A low whistle cut through the night, chillingly close. Tommy froze, his cane clattering down the steps. Go, he hissed, shoving her off the porch. Now. She stumbled, flashlight swinging, and saw it, a figure under the lamp, hat low, coat swaying, a cigarette's ember glowing red. The silent witness, real and here. She ran, Tommy's shout echoing behind her, hide. Her car was blocks away, too far. She ducked into an alley, heart pounding, and pressed against a wall, listening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Followed, then stopped. A rasp of a match, the faint scent of tobacco. He was close, hunting. Her phone buzzed, recording still on, and she silenced it, barely breathing. The steps resumed, fading toward the street. She waited, then slipped back to the inn, locking the door, her mind a storm of fear and resolve. Ellie's motel room was a fortress of locked doors and drawn curtains, but sleep was a distant hope. The silent witness, tall, thin, fedora tilted, cigarette glowing, had stepped out of the photograph and into her reality. Her hands shook as she replayed Tommy's recording on her phone. Tall, thin, moved slow, deliberate, voice like gravel. No loose ends. The words matched the figure she'd seen under the lamp, the one who'd followed her into the alley. He wasn't a ghost or a memory, he was alive, stalking her as he'd stalked Maggie. Dawn crept through the blinds, gray and weak, as she pored over her evidence. The cigarette butt, the locket, the enhanced photo, Tommy's confession, pieces of a puzzle spanning decades. Her grandmother's notes offered no suspect matching Tommy's description, but the initials EL from the letter nagged at her. Edith Larson, dead since 1960, couldn't be the killer, but she might have known him. And Tommy's bombshell, another death in 51, a drifter, suggested a pattern. Maggie had been digging into it, and it cost her life. Ellie grabbed her laptop, searching Willow Creek's digital archives. A 1951 article popped up, drifter vanishes near creek, foul play suspected. No body, no leads, just a vague mention of a tall stranger seen nearby. She cross-checked Edith Larson's census records, showed her living alone, a seamstress, no family. But a 1954 obituary noted she'd kept odd hours, often seen walking at night. A witness? An accomplice? Ellie needed more. She called Tommy, her fingers drumming nervously. No answer, just voicemail. Dread nodded her. He told her to hide, but what if he hadn't? She drove to Oak Street, the morning mist clinging to her windshield. His bungalow was dark, the mailbox stuffed with yesterday's paper. She knocked, then pounded. Silence. The door was unlocked, creaking open to reveal chaos. Furniture overturned, a lamp shattered. Tommy was gone. Her stomach lurched. She dialed 911, voice trembling as she reported a break-in, possible abduction. The dispatcher promised a patrol, but Willow Creek's police were slow, understaffed. Ellie searched the house, finding a photo frame cracked on the floor. Tommy as a boy, Maggie beside him, smiling. On the back, in faded ink, "To T my shadow." A nickname, a bond. He'd carried her memory all these years. Outside, tire tracks gouged the muddy lawn, fresh and deep. She snapped pictures, then spotted something glinting near the porch. A lucky strike, but identical to the one from the alley. The silent witness had been here. He'd taken Tommy, silencing the last loose end from 53, or so he thought. Ellie was still in the game, and she wouldn't run. Back at the inn, she uploaded the recording and photos to a cloud drive, emailing them to a friend in Indianapolis with a note. If I disappear, this is why. Paranoia, maybe, but the stakes were clear. She packed her bag, knife, flashlight, evidence, and headed to the creek from the 51 article. If the killer had a pattern, it might be his dumping ground. The creek ran sluggish and brown, bordered by tangled willows and forgotten farmland. Ellie parked near a rusted bridge, the air thick with damp earth and rot. She followed the bank, scanning for clues, her boots sinking into mud. A mile in, she found it. A clearing, overgrown but unnaturally flat, the soil darker than the rest. She knelt, brushing aside weeds, and uncovered a shard of bone, weathered but human. A rib, maybe. Her breath hitched. The drifter, a twig snapped behind her. She spun, knife out, but it was just a deer, bolting through the brush. She exhaled, shaky, then noticed a faint path leading deeper into the woods. It was worn, recent footprints, not animal tracks. She followed, the trees closing in, until the path ended at a shack. Sagging, its tin roof pitted with rust. Smoke curled from a makeshift chimney, thin but steady. Someone was inside. Her heart pounded as she crept closer, peering through a grimy window. A figure sat at a table, back to her, hunched over something, papers, maybe photos. Tall, thin, a gray fedora on a hook nearby. A lucky strike smoldered in an ashtray, its scent seeping through the cracks. It was him, the silent witness. Photos of Maggie, the drifter, and now Ellie littered the table, a gallery of his victims, past and present. "Drop it," he rasped again, his gravelly voice cutting through her panic. She let the knife fall, its clatter loud in the silence. "Good girl," he said, exhaling smoke, the revolver unwavering. "You're like her, Maggie. Too curious, too stubborn." He tapped the gun against a photo of Maggie, her lifeless form on Mason Avenue. "She saw me with the drifter, asked too many questions. Couldn't let that stand." Ellie's stomach churned, but she kept her eyes on him, searching for an opening. "And me?" she asked, voice steady despite her fear. "Why now?" He smirked, thin and cruel. "You woke it up. That picture should have stayed buried. Tommy too. Loose ends." He glanced at the old man who flinched under his gaze. "Saw me that night, the little coward. Kept quiet, till you came sniffing." He stood, slow and deliberate, the fedora casting a shadow across his face. "Name's Earl Lyman. Not that it matters now. Earl Lyman E.L. The initials from the letter clicked. "Edith Larson," Ellie said, testing a hunch. "She knew you, didn't she? Wrote that note to my grandmother." Earl's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise. "Edith," he muttered, almost fond. "My sister. Saw too much, talked too much. Shut her up in 60. You're good. I'll give you that." Her mind raced. 3 deaths now, a family secret turned murderous. She edged closer to Tommy, hands empty but mind sharp. "You've been here all along," she said, stalling. "Watching, waiting. Why not leave?" Earl lit another lucky strike, the match flaring briefly. "This town's mine. Keeps me safe. No one looks twice at an old man till you showed up." Tommy squirmed, his gag loosening. Ellie caught his eye, willing him to stay calm. She needed time. The cops might have found his house by now, might be searching. "You can't kill us both and walk away," she said, voice firm. "They'll know." Earl chuckled, a dry rasp. "They didn't know in 51. Didn't know in 53. Won't know now. Creek's deep." He stepped forward, revolver raised, and Ellie lunged, not at him, but at the table, shoving it hard. Photos and ashtray crashed to the floor, the cigarette igniting a stack of papers. Flames leapt up, sudden and fierce, and Earl cursed, swinging the gun. She ducked, grabbing her knife as Tommy rolled free of his ropes, desperation fueling him. "Run," she yelled, slashing at Earl's leg. He roared, stumbling, blood seeping through his pants. The fire spread, licking the shack's dry walls, smoke thickening fast. Ellie hauled Tommy up, his cane lost, and they staggered for the door. Earl fired, the shot wild, splintering wood above her head. She shoved Tommy out, diving after him as the shack blazed, heat searing her back. Earl's silhouette loomed in the doorway, gun raised, then vanished in a cough of smoke and flame. They stumbled to the creek, coughing, collapsing on the bank. Sirens wailed in the distance, finally, the cops. Ellie clutched Tommy, his frail frame shaking. "He's gone," he wheezed. "It's over." She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the burning shack, half expecting Earl to emerge. The fire consumed it, a pyre for the silent witness, his secrets turning to ash. Hours later, at the sheriff's station, Ellie gave her statement, the evidence, recording, photos, locket laid out. The bone shard from the creek was recovered, tied to the drifter's case. Earl Lyman, they confirmed, had lived on the town's fringes, a recluse since the 60s. No record, no trace until now. Tommy corroborated her story, his guilt spilling out in tears. "I should have spoken up," he said. "Maggie be alive." Ellie squeezed his hand. "You did now. That's enough." The sheriff promised justice, posthumous but real. Maggie's case would close, the drifters too. Back at the inn, Ellie packed, the enhanced photo on her bed. The silent witness was just a blur again, its power gone. She burned it that night. The flame, a quiet farewell to her grandmother's unfinished work. Driving out of Willow Creek, the oak on Mason Avenue stood sentinel, its shadow still. The town felt lighter, its silence less oppressive. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, a flicker, a hat, a coat, crossed the road, then vanished. She blinked, heart skipping, and it was gone. Imagination, she told herself, the hum of the engine drowning her doubt. Yet the chill lingered, a whisper of the shadow that had watched too long. Back in Indianapolis, life resumed, sketches, coffee, normalcy. The hum faded, the case a memory. But sometimes, late at night, she'd smell tobacco, faint and fleeting, and wonder if Earl Lyman's ghost still lingered, a silent witness to her victory or her survival.